So, you know that we are talking about presidents and civil rights, right? And this next guest, at first I didn't want to talk about him, but it's important that we talk about him. It's important that we talk about the founding fathers and the truth, the reality when it comes to their thoughts and their actions, and other races, okay? Whether it be black, indigenous, Asian, okay? And I'm speaking, of course, about Thomas Jefferson. He is a man who has been put on a pedestal, considered a great thinker, founding father, Declaration of Independence, all that, right? But in reality, he was just a man with faulty thinking, questionable morals, questionable principles. I'm not being biased. The evidence is right there for anybody to read. You just have to be willing to read it. Now, because there is so much information on him, I had to condense it down, and I had a hard time condensing it down because there's so much stuff. So, I was fortunate enough to find understandingprejudice.com, and it more clearly explains the wishy-washiness that was Thomas Jefferson. And I will start with what I found there. On one hand, Jefferson wrote that slavery was a great political and moral evil, involving the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other part. He says, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." He even referred to the international slave trade. On one hand, Jefferson viewed black people as inferior to whites in reasoning ability, holding that one could scarcely be found capable of comprehending the investigations of Euclid. And he opposed sexual relations between black and white people, writing of blacks, "Their amalgamation with the other color produces a degradation to which no lover of his country, no lover of excellence in the human character can innocently consent." On the other hand, Sally Hemings. On one hand, Jefferson wrote that he had scruples about selling Negroes, but for delinquency or on their own request. On the other hand, between 1784 and 1794, Jefferson sold or gave away an estimated 161 people. He even sold 10 to 14-year-old slave children or transferred them from one plantation to another. On one hand, Jefferson wrote of slavery, "There is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach." On the other hand, Jefferson never emancipated the 200-plus slaves he owned, and the closest he came to supporting the abolition of slavery was to favor the removal and colonization of slaves outside the United States. Now, I don't want to forget to add that Jefferson wrote legislation banning the importation of enslaved people, first into Virginia and then into the state, as though it was the altruistic thing. If anybody read into it further, they would come to find that the banning of what would become the transatlantic slave trade was not done out of the kindness of Jefferson. He did it to bolster the domestic slave trade. Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina had begun selling enslaved people to the Deep South, and Virginia and Maryland in particular had begun the forced breeding of black women and selling their children to the Deep South. The selling of enslaved people to the Deep South became the second highest export for Virginia, and because of that, Jefferson passed legislation to help his cause. He once told George Washington, "A child raised every 2 years is of more profit than the crop of the best laboring man. After the Revolutionary War, when Jefferson was part of the Virginia General Assembly, he was asked to introduce a bill to add gradual emancipation as an amendment, and he refused, saying that it was better that this should be kept back. In 1819, he strongly opposed a Missouri statehood application amendment that banned domestic slave importation and freed slaves at the age of 25, believing it would destroy or break up the Union. And Jefferson used his enslaved people as collateral for a very large loan he had taken out in 1796. In order to rebuild Monticello, and he pioneered the monetization of enslaved people. This is the man who wrote that all men are created equal. This is the man who wrote that. But we have to remember, he wasn't talking about women, and he certainly wasn't talking about black people when he wrote those words. He was not talking about black people when he wrote the words that all men are created equal. Yet people idolize him. This country puts him on a pedestal, and he's considered a deep thinker. This man, who's considered a deep thinker, believed that orangutans had intercourse with black women. I'm not kidding. Look it up. He believed that orangutans had intercourse with black women, and he's considered a deep thinker. He's a believer in scientific racism, and he's considered a deep thinker, a man that we're supposed to put on a pedestal because he said that all men are created equal, even though he was excluding black people. And this man is your idol.